Hi, this is Wavestate from Korg. It's a new take on their original Wavestation from the 90s. It's not a reissue, but rather a completely new synth with a much bigger sample library, a more user-friendly interface, and modular-style sequencing options. It also has a vector synthesis engine built in. It has up to 64 stereo voices and is 4-part multitimbral. In this video, I'll take a look at whether it's easy to use and of course explain both wave sequencing and vector synthesis. More of this jam at the end of this video. Let's get started. The original Wavestation from the 90s had two main problems. First, it was notoriously difficult to program. And second, its ability to sequence sounds, while an impressive effect at first, tended to sound repetitive and monotonous. Each step had its own sample, pitch, and timing all locked together. The main thing that's new about Wavestate, aside from a much larger sample library, is that you can sequence the pitch, timing, and other parameters of these sounds separately in sequences or lanes that have a different number of steps or playback directions and even looping points from each other. This lets you create sequences that evolve and are much more organic rather than simple repeating loops. Each element, like the sample used, the pitch and timing, gets its own lane, and every new step, all the information from the different lanes is combined into a single sound. I'll show you plenty of examples when we talk about the individual lanes. This can be used for rhythmic patches like this one, but also for much more subtle ones like this one. So for example, this preset or performance has 3 different layers. Let's just listen to them one by one. This is layer A. Okay, you can see the timing lane, sample lane, and pitch lane all change step by step. And what you're hearing is a combination of these 3, each with their own length and loop order. This is layer B. It's these sounds. And you can hear the sample change and its shape change as well. Very subtle. This is layer C. And then together, they sound like this. Before we look at the details of Wave Sequencing 2.0, Wavestate also has a vector synthesis engine. The idea is quite simple. As you saw before, you can load up to 4 different sounds or waveforms into each of the layers. With vector synthesis, you can change the relative volume of each of these layers to get either a joint sound or morph from one sound to the other. So this is the sound in layer A. And then this is the sound in layer B, layer C, layer D, and I can play any combination of those sounds. You can also automate this motion with a vector envelope. We'll talk about that later. And alongside all these complex options, Wavestate also has obviously more simple sounds in its sound library. There are a few types of pianos. And plenty of other sounds. Wavestate contains all the samples from the original Wavestation, as well as new Wavestate samples and a bunch of samples from the Plugin Guru library. And you can go through the whole list or sort by category. So I can go into here and say, okay, I just want to see Plugin Guru samples that are string ensembles. Let's take a look at the hardware overall. At first, it does seem a little overwhelming, but a lot of this is standard synth stuff like effects, the filter envelopes, and macros, LFOs, not to mention pitch and mod wheels. What's unique to WaveState is the interface that it uses to implement wave sequencing, in particular these two sections. Let's take a look at a sample sound. Okay, so let's go, for example, to the pitch lane. And as long as I press the wave sequencing steps button, I have a view into the pitch lane over here. Let's expand it a little bit. Okay, these are my pitch steps, which are running independently of my sample steps. Let's take a listen to that. I can move around that. So what you see here on screen is represented here as well. For the lane that I'm looking at currently, back to my pitch lane. These 8 white knobs, by the way, are just macro knobs that you can assign to any parameter that you like. If the performance mod knobs light is on, then they apply to all the layers. If it's off, then their function changes based on the layer that is the active layer. Back to the hardware. Aside from that, the synth is plastic, and while it isn't bendy in any way, it's surprisingly light. The keys are full size and velocity sensitive without aftertouch, but the synth does respond to aftertouch and polyphonic aftertouch over MIDI. The screen is clear and viewable from any angle, and on the back are MIDI in, out, and MIDI over USB. There's no USB audio, by the way. You've got 2 1/4-inch outputs as well as a headphone out. Just to complete the capabilities overview, WaveState is a multi-timbral digital synth with up to 64 stereo voices and multiple effects per layer. The machine state is called a performance. Each performance has 4 layers, which can hold a completely different program, which includes different sounds and sequences. And you can either layer these sounds one on top of the other, split them across the keyboard, or any combination thereof, including layers based on velocity. Okay, let's dive a little deeper and look at the home screen. You get to it by pressing the home icon here or the perform button, and it gives you a bird's eye view of all the lanes in the current layer. So these are the lanes in layer A, these are the lanes in layer B, layer C is a multi-sample lane, we'll talk about that later, layer D is this. Now these buttons have a double function. They either let you choose presets if they're in set list mode. So these are the different performances, which are a combination of layers. WaveState can store virtually as many performances as you like. Set lists are links to up to 64 performances in 4 banks. This is bank D. If I hold this button and say press A, I get to bank A, and then choose a performance in that bank. There are 7 lanes in a layer. You can see that over here as well. Master, timing, sample, pitch, shape, gate, and step sequence. Like I mentioned before, pressing Waveseq steps takes you out of setlist mode and lets you edit the various steps for each of the lanes. You can see both on screen and over here as I press a note, it moves through the samples in the sample lane for layer A. These are the other layers, by the way. Let's just shut off the other layers so we can focus on this one. If you want to edit the steps of a layer, you just press the step. You can see the names of the samples here. Bowl 1, marimba, bowl 2, glass bell, and so on. These are the samples this lane is going through. If you hit enter and a particular step, it'll just stay on that. So that's the sample in the step. I can use the arrow keys to edit different parameters, for example, the sample type. Say, change it to this, and go back to the sequence. Back to the screen, the top left corner tells you which layer I'm editing, A, B, C, or D. When you hit a particular step or any other parameter page, if there are multiple pages, you can page through them using Shift Page Minus and Page Plus. Notice there are 3 pages here. As you can see in the dots on the top right corner, you move through the different parameters with these 2 arrows and change values with the value knob. Labels under the buttons are accessed with the Shift key, and you can double tap Shift if you want to change a parameter without holding Shift. So Wavestate sort of saves you menu diving by taking you directly to the parameter page of the function you press. So for example, the pitch LFOs parameter page is here. I can move between the parameters, and basically that's it for the pitch LFO. But as we saw before, some buttons take you to functions that have multiple pages, and then you use the page indicators on top to see where you are within the parameters of that function. Okay, so we'll talk about general synthy stuff later on. Let's get to the meat of wave sequencing and talk about what each of the individual lanes does. We'll get to the master lane in a bit. Let's first understand the other ones. The timing lane lets you sequence the absolute length or tempo synced timing of each step. Take, for example, this preset. It has multiple samples in the sample lane, but the timing of each step is different, and this is the result we get. So for example, if I was to set the loop end all the way here, we are now just stuck on this step in the timing lane. Note, now the timing has become regular. If I expand the loop range within the timing lane to a little bit more, you see that we're back to steps with irregular timing. So let's say that I felt that this last step over here, which is in bank B, step bank B, so it's not steps 1 to 16, but steps 17 to 32. Let's just get to it first. Okay, we're back on the last step now in bank B. I would go into bank B. Okay, this is bank A. And this is bank B. Last step. I could focus on it by holding enter and pressing the step. So now only it gets played. And now I can go into duration and change that to any duration I want. Make it faster or slower. Let's make it real fast. So now this is the last step. I can then go ahead and expand, unsolo it, and we're back to my pattern. And that's what's unique about Wave Sequencing 2.0. The timing lane has a completely different length than the sampling lane. You can have one step, like we saw before, and the sampling lane could have many more. Now I won't go over all the parameters of all the lanes, but one of the important functions of the timing lane, aside from setting the timing of each step, is determining the crossfade between the samples from step to step. So for example, in this preset, we're cycling through these different samples, and right now, crossfade is set to 0. If I go and edit this step, but I can increase that and blend between the samples in the sample lane seamlessly. Back to 0. Let's maybe take a look at one more example. Here we're going through the samples in the sample lane very abruptly. But if I go into the step and increase the crossfade, we can go from sample to sample very smoothly. So those are the two main things you need to know about the timing lane. Let's take a brief look at the sample lane. I think we covered this pretty well before. Each step gets its own sample. I'll just mute the other ones so you can hear us cycle between the different samples in this sequence. It's pretty awesome. You can also hear, obviously, the subtle crossfades here. When you press a specific step, you can see the parameters for that particular step. Again, I won't cover all of these. Obviously, transpose is self-explanatory. Each step in all the lanes has a probability factor. 100% means there's a 100% chance that it will happen. If you reduce that, you can see now the step is being skipped 20% of the time, 50% chance, half the time, and so on. Up to 2 steps can be skipped with probabilities, so let's lower the probability for step 2 as well. Let's maybe increase this a bit. Put it at around 30%, this one around 30%. So we get one of these 3 samples. Let's move on to pitch lanes, and I've loaded up a different performance just for fun. Pitch lanes, very simply pitch the samples. Let's reduce the range. This is step 1. I can press it to see how much it's transposing the sample. Go step by step. Look at the whole pattern. And as I extend the range, we'll play through all these steps. Pitch lanes, like all the other lanes, have up to 64 steps and 4 banks of 16 steps. I want to show you a more subtle use for pitch lanes here. There are 4 steps in this sequence, and we're going back and forth in the sequence. And it's just really nice how this plays when you play multiple notes. It's not exactly an arpeggiator because the pattern fades out and starts with every step, as opposed to arpeggiators that are time synced. And the result, I think, is a really nice generative style performance. All right, let's move on to shape lanes, and I've loaded up another performance for this. The shape lane lets you set special per step envelopes that can impact various destinations. So if we listen to this pattern, we're on shape step 1. Let's go to sequencing, press this. It's just on, all on, but if I go ahead and change that, notice we're impacting the level of the sound now. So quite a few rhythmic options here. Yeah, and shape lanes can do their own thing, either move through different shapes, or I can just pick one manually. Notice how we're cycling through the different shapes and impacting currently the level, the volume of our sound. And you can also have shape impact pitch and step sequencing if it's turned on in the parameter pages for pitch and step sequencing. Let's move on to the gate lane. That's pretty simple. It's just how long the note is open for each step. Have it open for a short while or longer. Gate's a simple parameter, and it also has probability. And then step sequencing is also pretty simple. It's another lane that lets you set a different level value on a per step basis. We need to activate that with modulation, so we'll get back to this when we talk about the mod matrix. Overall, though, you just go into each step and set the value for that particular step. Anywhere between minus 100% to plus 100%. There's also a more advanced function that lets you determine how it's impacted by other modulation sources. I won't get into that in this tutorial. Okay, so we covered all 6 lanes. I promised you we'd get back to the master lane. Let's listen to what this does. So this is our beat, and why don't I just cancel all the other layers so we listen just to the drum layer. Let's turn off the master lane. So if we do that, then we get this sort of beat, which is sort of organized, but not so much. If I turn on the master lane, what this will do is force restart all the lanes in that layer and bring nice order into this chaos. And using this knob, I can modulate the master lane length and create different beats. I'm force resetting the lanes. Really nice way to create different beats, but also sort of to set up chaos and then make sure that there's some order to it based on whatever master length you determine. So we talked about the different lanes. Let's talk about the different lane controls. I'll go back to this lovely little preset, which cycles through these 4 steps. Like I mentioned before, you've got 3 core loop modes, either only forward, only backwards, or back and forth. I can activate random order. Note advance is pretty cool. Let me turn off random. If I turn on note advance, then the sequence will advance every time I press another note. So rather than always starting with step 1, I can cycle through the different steps. In this case it's pitch, but I can also cycle through samples or anything else. You can also set overall lane start and end points and loop start and end points. And you may have noticed that each lane has 3 different pages that you can page through, but really the page in the middle is the one that matters, is the one that changes the most from lane to lane. The first page sets the loop start and end points and the overall lane start and end points and how many repeats it has. Generally speaking, there are obviously exceptions and other parameters. And then the third page, to the right of the middle page, has lane utilities. So again, for each of the lanes, it's always lane utilities on page 3. This lets you cut steps, copy paste, insert steps, and change the lane length. The timing lane is special in that not only does it have a general speed parameter, but it also has a utility that lets you scale timing as well. Okay, so that's wave sequencing in a nutshell. Let's take a look at the more regular synth features in Wavestate. I'll go over these rather quickly, except the things that make it stand out. Starting with a filter, there are quite a few filter models here. I picked a sawtooth wave, by the way, out of the plugin guru samples. This is a quick filter sweep of the Plug 6 filter without resonance. Let's add some. Sounds pretty nice. Let's try the MS-20 filter. Of course, the character here is the resonance. There's a shortcut to high-pass filter. Let's try that as well. 2-pole high-pass filter with resonance. But there are plenty more filter types. So if we just look at these very briefly, you can see, obviously we're not going to go through all of these. There's even a multi-mode filter that morphs between filter types. So plenty of filter options here. A gain option as well. There are some other options based on the filter that you use. Mod depth options, key tracking as well, with a whole bunch of options for that. The multi-filter will let you crossfade between 2 different filter modes, and yeah, a lot of options here. So say I could choose to morph between, let's say, the dry plus bandpass option and just a regular low pass option, and the crossfade will take care of that for me. Of course, all of these parameters are legitimate modulation destinations, so let's talk about modulation. You've got quick access to filter, amp, and pitch envelopes. We'll get to vector in a second. Amp envelope, as well as the other envelopes, are typical ADSR envelopes. Attack, decay, to sustain level, and release times. There's also a nice dedicated velocity knob to quickly bring in keyboard velocity control. So that's the amp envelope. The filter envelope, very similar, except that the sustain level also goes into negative territory, which is pretty cool. Let's just turn the filter down with some resonance. You determine envelope mod intensity here. So, usual stuff, as you'd expect. except the sustain level goes down below 0, which means that release can take it up. As you can hear here, making that little ringing sound, especially if I give it a little release in the amp envelope. So nice touch there with negative sustain. You've got a few additional parameters like curve control. So this is our decay stage. I go ahead and change that to either linear or exponential. And then you can also trigger the envelopes, not just with note on, but also with a bunch of other modulation sources. So this is pretty standard. The vector envelope is the one that's quite special. If I go ahead and load a preset that I happen to prepare for that. So this preset has 4 layers. I can morph between them manually using the vector joystick. I got a triangle here, unison saw here, this sound on C, and this sound on D. A vector envelope will simply modulate the vector position for me. You access the vector envelope by pressing the vector button. It has 3 stages and then a last release stage. And you just edit the various steps using the joystick. So let's say I'll start over here, and then in step 2, move over here. Step 3, which is called to here because the first step is 0, move over here. Then the third step, move over here. And the release stage will get me back here, why not? So now this motion is basically done for me by the vector envelope. There are a few other options. You can determine coordinates on an XY grid, set the time for each step. So if I wanted to move slower, I could do that quite easily. I could also set the envelope to repeat a few times. All the way to infinity, change the time scale as well. Essentially turning it into an LFO, which will come in handy in a bit. So speaking of LFOs, you've got 4 of them. A pan LFO directly on the panel is a nice touch. You can set the frequency. You need, of course, a mod depth or intensity. You should hear panning now. You've got earphones on. Let's add a filter, LFO as well. Again, set intensity. And let's change its shape. You can change the start phase of the LFO, add an offset, change the curve, fade it in, which is cool. And you've got all these shapes. Usual suspects, a guitar shape for pitch bends, exponential triangle, stepped options. These can be tempo synced. Maybe reduce the frequency just a bit. There's random sample and hold with random timing. A few random options and smooth, random. You can create vibrato with the pitch envelope, either subtle or not. Doesn't go quite into audio rates, up to 32 Hertz. So, not really suitable for FM. But there are a few nice effects to be had there as well. Maybe if I reduce this and this just to clean up the noise. You also have an amp envelope, which is good for anything from simple tremolo, and again at near audio rates. Just sort of like a gritty sound. So those are the LFOs and the envelopes. Beyond these simple modulation sources and destinations, there's a lot more modulation going on in the mod matrix. Let's talk about that very briefly. So let's say that I wanted to modulate the filter cutoff, but I wanted to do that through a controller, through the mod wheel. I couldn't do that with this direct routing over here. To see the mod matrix, I press the mod button. Currently it's empty. To add a new mod slot, I hold mod and press this arrow. I choose a mod target, as it says here, by moving the knob of the target parameter. And I want my mod sources to be both the LFO, filter LFO, and the mod wheel. I can start with either one. Let's start with the mod wheel. Okay, so now the mod wheel is connected to the filter cutoff. Let's press enter to continue. It won't do anything unless I increase the intensity of the modulation. Now I've got this mod wheel controlling the filter cutoff. If I hit the mod matrix button again, I can view this one mod slot that I have in my matrix and add an intensity source to it as well. So let's go ahead and go to this parameter. If I hit enter, I get a pop-up that lets me select multiple other mod sources. And I can go back and forth here or just simply press the button or turn the knob and it'll jump directly to the parameter that I want, which is the filter LFO. And if I hit enter, I now have these two sources, the mod wheel and the filter LFO, impacting the filter cutoff. So now the mod wheel not only controls the cutoff, but also the intensity of the modulation of the LFO. So that's how you modulate destinations that have knobs associated with them. You could also modulate other parameters that don't have knobs connected to them. Let's say, for example, and I'm just going to go into, let's say, the step sequencer and this first step, and I go into the value parameter, right? This doesn't have a knob associated with it, but if I stand on it and hit mod and plus, and then hit enter to modulate the current parameter, it now becomes my modulation destination. So step sequence slot A is the value, and then it needs a source attached to it. I can choose any source. Let's just say this mod knob, the master performance mod knob, and I've just created another slot in the mod matrix. I can determine its intensity, and I'm done. Notice a scroll bar now appears to show that there's more than one mod slot in use. So I could just continue, add another mod destination. Let's say again the filter, but this time to control it with this knob. Hit enter to continue. Now I've got a third slot here. I mentioned this before, I'll just say it again. The mod knobs can either work on a performance level or on a per layer basis. So let's add another mod slot and maybe modulate the resonance. And I'll use, say, this knob. Notice now the source is the layer mod knob, not the performance mod knob. And in case you're curious, let's just go over the number of modulation sources. These are the controllers that you have access to. So quite a few, including aftertouch and polyphonic aftertouch. Mod knobs, again, all of these guys over here. Then our generators are the envelopes, vector envelopes, LFOs, and mod processors. I'll get to that in a second. And then you've got MIDI CCs as well, either unipolar or bipolar. So just to complete this crazy mod matrix picture, the mod processors, and you've got two of them, let you take a mod source and then apply a certain transformation to it. So you choose the controller over here. Let's say that I wanted to transform the filter LFO. I could go ahead and apply any number of transformations to it. I could smooth it, quantize it, apply an offset to it. I won't get into this now, but you can see there's quite a lot going on here. Let's move on, talk about the arpeggiator. It has one. And you can lash it if you like. It has the usual suspect options. Resolution. Swing. Octaves, gate control, and sync makes sure that the arpeggiator is in sync with the wave sequences. What's special about the arpeggiator is that you've got 4 of them, 1 per layer, and you can activate them simultaneously, which I think is pretty neat. Let's move on. Let's take a look at the effects. Each layer gets 3 effects slots: pre-effects, modulation effects, and a delay, where you can choose from one of several options, and then there are overall master effects, a reverb, and EQ. As per the layers, you turn them on or off by double tapping them. Let's just go through them briefly. I won't obviously check them all out. There's compressor, ring modulator, tremolo. This wave shaper effect is pretty cool, and each effect has a few presets that you can try out. Let's say, for example, go with this one. There's wet dry control. And needless to say, these are all modulatable parameters. The effects parameters, though, can't be modulated by the per voice mod sources. So these are the LFOs and the envelopes, but they can be modulated, say, by the vector envelope or any of the controllers. Anyway, those are the pre-effects. The mod effects are the typical modulation effects you'd expect, and there are a few of those in here. Let's maybe start from the beginning. These all have dry-wet control, in addition to 3 effects parameters. Which you access using this knob and 2 shift controls. Let's quickly go through these. So phaser, wah. A lot of nice modulation options here. Yeah, that wasn't me. Then delays. A few options here. And multiple presets. So this is a ping pong style delay, and there are a few other options as well. As per before, you've got parameter controls using this knob and shift controls. So these 3 effects are available on a per layer basis, and then you've got overall reverb, which I can turn on. There are a couple of options here. Overb is the biggest one. And you've got dry wet control. And then size. And again, shift controls, time, and timbre. Okay, a topic I want to cover very briefly. Any simple sound generally takes up 2 voices if it's a wave sequence sound. And if I go into utilities, you can see in system stats, I press 1 node, no matter how simple it is. It uses 2 voices at a time. It always keeps another voice around in case I want to morph into another sample in the sample lane. If I know my layer is going to use just a simple sound and I don't want any wave sequencing, I can hit this button and then move it into single multi-sample mode, in which case any sample I choose here will take up only 1 voice. In case you're not familiar with the term multi-sample, by the way, it's a method of sampling where multiple samples are used for different notes up and down the keyboard, rather than just taking 1 sample and transposing it up and down algorithmically, which doesn't retain the original character of the sampled instrument across a broad range of pitched notes. And you can use multi-samples in wave sequence mode as well. Before I get to the pros and cons, just a few miscellaneous things I wanted to make sure that I cover. There are quite a few interesting options hidden in the pages of the Perform menu, like, for example, setting levels on a per layer basis, or determining velocity zones, which means different layers will play based on the velocity with which you hit a note. You can also set up zones on a per layer basis, split the keyboard up, so you get certain layers playing on one part of the keyboard, and others playing on a different split. And you've got a few more miscellaneous options like a unison, legato, note priority, and even microtonal scales. I won't dig into the various options in the utility menu. Noteworthy things here: the SST, or smooth sound transition parameter, basically makes sure that when you play a performance and then move on to a new one, it'll hang on to the old sound for as many seconds as you determine. Then you can seamlessly play the next performance. Wavestate also has a nifty randomize function, which lets you randomize either specific lanes or the entire performance. Let's do that, why not? might get interesting results. And if you want, you can also randomize specific elements of a performance rather than the whole thing. Another useful little feature is the ability to save and load not just entire performances, but also individual programs, which is everything a layer contains, and individual wave sequences or even individual lanes. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons, and for the cons, I'll put a particularly ominous sound. So, while you have plenty of direct controls for multiple parameters, you're going to need to get comfortable with editing parameters in a menu and a bit of menu diving here and there. I think Korg has done an excellent job with the user interface here, considering the sheer number of available options, but still, to create your own sounds as opposed to just playing presets, you'll need to get comfortable with using the arrow keys and page keys to get to the parameters you need. Maybe a slightly gentler tone for the rest of the cons. While Korg will make a librarian app for managing presets, there are currently no plans for creating a full-fledged companion app for editing sounds. The biggest feature on my wish list is the ability to load my own samples into Wavestate, which currently isn't possible. Again, here too, Korg says that's not on the roadmap, at least not now. There are plenty of sounds on board, so there's a good likelihood you'll find what you're looking for or something similar, but obviously that doesn't compare to the ability to load in your own samples. Another feature I'd like to see is a hold when the arpeggiator is off. Maybe I missed it. You can latch the arpeggiator, but you can't hold notes if the arpeggiator isn't active. You want this in case you have a pattern going without an arpeggiator and you want to change chords without stopping. Currently you can't do that because there isn't a hold function, but if you hook up a damper pedal, which is what I have, you can hold the chord, hold the damper pedal, then change the chord. It still doesn't get proper sync like Latch would, but it's a partial solution. So if you buy this synth, I recommend getting a damper pedal. I use this one, it's about 19 bucks. I'll link to it in the description. Another little quibble, there's no undo if you accidentally swap out your performance before saving the one you were editing. I've lost a few presets this way, so if you're editing a performance, save often. Final on my cons list, unless I missed something, you can't currently favorite samples or wave sequences or anything else. So you can scroll through the list quickly if you sort of turn the value encoder fast, right? So I can get from the last sample all the way to the first one quickly. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of samples here. And going through them again every time is pretty tedious. So you do need to go through them to get acquainted with them, but it would be nice if you could favorite samples and just put them in a separate list. A search function would also be nice as well. On the pro side, and let's try a happier preset, well, this is the first week of January 2020, and I can safely say this is the most interesting synth to come out this year. Joking aside, any synth coming out this year will have its work cut out in terms of competing with the timbral flexibility, sequencing powers, and price point of Wavestate. The diversity of sounds Wavestate can make alongside the wave sequencing options means making music with it is quite a unique and engaging experience. Korg have managed to take inspiration from some of the most interesting concepts behind modular sequencing and bring them together in a relatively approachable and easy to use environment without requiring any patch cables. And to my knowledge, there isn't another synth capable of what Wavestate does, not only in hardware form, but also in software. Wavestate is also quite compact, light, and portable, so fitting it in with a few companions should be fairly easy. And if you want plenty of ideas on what to do with so many mod sources and destinations, check out my ever-expanding book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the bell after you subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.